Everything began on the night the wind stopped, and the stars began to sing. Thomas Harker had been driving the same stretch of Wyoming highway for 17 years. His 18-wheeler carried grain from Casper to Cheyenne, then back again, a pendulum existence measured in miles and diesel fuel. The road had become more than a route. It had become his church, his confession booth, his escape from a house that still smelled like his wife's perfume 3 years after the funeral. The landscape around him was ancient and indifferent. Sagebrush stretched toward horizons that seemed to curve away from the earth itself. The mountains in the distance wore their snowcaps like crowns, silent witnesses to countless human journeys that meant nothing to their geological patience. Thomas had stopped noticing beauty somewhere between his 40th birthday and the day Mary's heart gave out in the garden she loved. But on this particular November evening, something was different. The wind, which usually howled across these plains like a living thing, had simply ceased. Not gradually, not with any natural transition. It just stopped, as if someone had pressed pause on the world's breathing. Thomas noticed it first in the way his truck's movements changed. The constant push and pull against the crosswinds vanished, leaving his steering wheel suddenly light in his hands. He slowed down, not from any conscious decision, but from an instinct older than words. The sun had set an hour ago, and the darkness out here was absolute. The kind of darkness that reminded you how small you were, how the universe cared nothing for your plans or prayers. Except tonight, the darkness felt aware. Thomas pulled his truck onto the shoulder, his hazard lights casting rhythmic orange pulses into the void. He killed the engine, something he never did on these lonely stretches, and the silence that followed was profound. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else, something that made his ears ring with pressure, as if he'd descended into deep water. That's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was another truck's headlights, distant and approaching. But the light didn't move the way headlights move. It didn't bob or sway with the road's contours. It simply grew, expanding like a drop of luminescence spreading across dark water. The color was wrong too. Not the harsh white or yellow of human technology, but something softer, more organic, like moonlight filtered through morning mist. Thomas reached for his phone, that modern reflex of documentation, but his hand stopped halfway. Something in him knew, with a certainty that bypassed reason, that this moment wasn't meant to be captured. It was meant to be experienced, to be felt, with senses that cameras couldn't translate. The light descended without sound, without the roar of engines or the displacement of air that should accompany something so massive moving through space. It settled onto the prairie about 100 yards from his truck, and in its glow, Thomas could see the sagebrush bending as if pressed by an invisible hand, creating a perfect circle of flattened earth. His heart hammered against his ribs, but fear wasn't the only thing he felt. There was something else, something he couldn't name, a pull gentle but insistent, like the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and wanting, just for a moment, to lean forward into the emptiness. Thomas opened his truck door. The metal creaked, absurdly loud in the stillness. His boots hit the asphalt and he walked toward the light without deciding to walk, his legs moving as if they belonged to someone else, someone braver or more foolish than he'd ever been. The closer he got, the more the light seemed to pulse in rhythm with something, not his heartbeat, but something deeper, slower, like the turning of seasons or the orbit of planets. Colors he didn't have names for swirled within it, hues that seemed to exist between the ones he knew, shades that made his eyes water not from pain but from beauty. And then he saw the figure. It stood at the light's edge, neither fully within nor fully without, as if it existed in two places at once. Thomas's mind tried to process what he was seeing, tried to fit it into categories of human or animal or machine, but it resisted all classification. The being was tall, perhaps 7 feet, perhaps more, with proportions that were almost human, but not quite. Its skin, if it could be called skin, seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, creating the impression of movement, even when it stood perfectly still. But it was the eyes that stopped Thomas in his tracks, that made his breath catch and his throat close, with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite awe. The eyes were large, almond-shaped, and they held within them something that looked like recognition, as if this being knew him, as if it had always known him. Thomas wanted to speak, to ask the questions that were piling up in his mind like traffic at a standstill. What are you? Where are you from? Why are you here? But his voice had abandoned him. His tongue felt thick and useless. his lips unable to form the shapes of words. The being raised one hand, a gesture so human in its simplicity that it made Thomas's eyes burn with unexpected tears. And then, without speaking, without any movement of a mouth or any sound that his ears could detect, Thomas heard it. Not words exactly, not language as he understood it, but meaning pure and undiluted, flowing directly into his consciousness like water finding its level. The communication bypassed his ears entirely, arriving in his mind as fully formed concepts that came with emotional weight and sensory details he couldn't possibly have imagined on his own. Peace, the being communicated. You are safe. You have been safe since before you learned to fear. Thomas fell to his knees not from worship or terror, but from the sheer weight of that statement. How many years had he spent afraid? Afraid of loss, afraid of loneliness, afraid of the vast indifference of a universe that had taken Mary from him without explanation or apology. And here now, this whatever it was telling him that safety wasn't something to be earned or achieved, but something that had always existed, a fundamental property of existence itself. You grieve, the being continued, and Thomas felt the words wrap around his heart like hands, gentle but firm. You believe you have been abandoned, but nothing is ever truly lost. Energy transforms. Love transforms. It does not end. Mary, Thomas managed to whisper, his voice cracking on the single syllable of her name. The being tilted its head, and Thomas felt another wave of meaning wash over him. She is not gone. She is changed. As you will change. As all things change. The universe does not subtract. It only reorganizes. Images flooded Thomas's mind then, visions that weren't memories but felt more real than any memory he possessed. He saw the cosmos not as empty space punctuated by lonely stars, but as a living tapestry, every thread connected to every other thread, vibrating with purpose and intelligence. He saw Earth from above, a blue jewel wrapped in clouds, and he understood, without knowing how he understood, that his planet was not isolated, not forgotten, but part of a vast communion of worlds, all evolving, all moving towards something. You call it God, the being communicated, and Thomas felt the word expand in his mind, becoming larger than the narrow definitions he'd learned in Sunday school. Others use different names. The name matters less than the reality it points toward. There is a consciousness that permeates all existence, a love that holds every atom in its embrace. Your religions have touched this truth, each one grasping a different facet of something too vast for any single perspective to contain. Jesus, Thomas said, the name emerging from somewhere deep in his childhood, from the white church on the hill where his grandmother had taken him every Sunday, where he'd sung hymns and learned to pray and had, somewhere along the way, stopped believing any of it meant anything. The being's response came with a warmth that made Thomas's chest ache. The one you called Jesus understood. He saw past the illusion of separation, past the fear that makes you believe you are alone. He tried to show you that the kingdom you seek is not distant or future. It is here now in the space between your breaths. He tried to show you that you are all connected, all expressions of the same divine consciousness, all loved beyond measure. But he died, Thomas said, and he was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered face, carving paths through the dust that had accumulated during his long drive. They killed him. They always kill the good ones. What's the point of any of it if suffering is all that waits for the righteous? Death is not an ending, the being responded, and its presence seemed to intensify, to become more solid and real than anything Thomas had ever perceived. It is a doorway. The one you called Jesus walked through that doorway and showed you what lies beyond. He returned to prove that consciousness persists, that love is stronger than the mechanisms of matter. His message was not about escaping this world, it was about transforming it, about recognizing that heaven and earth were never separate. They are the same place, viewed from different states of awareness. The prairie around them seemed to shimmer then, as if reality itself was becoming translucent, revealing layers beneath layers beneath layers. Thomas could see for just a moment what looked like other versions of the same space, other timelines, other possibilities, all existing simultaneously, all equally real. He saw himself in a dozen different configurations, married to someone else, never married at all, dead in a car accident at 23, alive and old and surrounded by grandchildren he'd never had. And he understood that all of these versions were true in their own way, that reality was far stranger and more generous than he'd ever imagined. A change is coming, the being continued, and now its communication carried an urgency that made Thomas's breath quicken. Your people have many names for it. Some call it the rapture, some call it the awakening, some call it the return. The words are different, but they point to the same event, a shift in consciousness, a transformation of awareness. Those who have prepared themselves, who have learned to see past fear and separation, will transition smoothly. They will recognize the change for what it is. Others will experience it as chaos, as loss, as the end of all things. When? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When will this happen? The being was silent for a moment, and Thomas felt it, considering how to translate concepts that had no human equivalent into terms he could grasp. Time is not what you believe it to be. It is not a river flowing in one direction. It is more like a room, where all moments exist simultaneously, and what you call past and future are simply different corners of that room. The change has already begun. You feel it, do not you? The acceleration of events, the sense that reality is becoming unstable, that the old certainties are dissolving. Thomas nodded, though he hadn't consciously realized it until now. The world did feel different lately, not just because of his personal grief, but in some larger, more fundamental way. The news was full of things that seemed impossible, events that defied prediction or explanation. People were angrier, more divided, more desperate. But at the same time, he'd noticed something else. Pockets of extraordinary kindness, moments of unexpected grace, stories of people waking up to something larger than themselves. By your calendar, the being continued, the threshold will be crossed within 5 years. 2030 is significant, not because the universe cares about your numbering system, but because enough souls will have reached a critical point of readiness by then. The transformation will cascade across your species like falling dominoes. Those who resist will find themselves left behind, not by judgment or punishment, but by their own choice to cling to fear rather than embrace love. How do I prepare? Thomas asked, and he was surprised by the desperation in his own voice. How do I make sure I'm ready? I've spent so long being angry, being lost. What if I'm not one of the ones who can see? The being moved closer, and Thomas felt its presence envelop him like a blanket, like being held by something infinitely patient and infinitely kind. You prepare by remembering who you really are. Not the small story you tell yourself, the story of Thomas Harker, the truck driver, the widower, the man who failed to save his wife or find his purpose, but the larger truth that you are consciousness itself, temporarily focused through the lens of a human form. You are the universe experiencing itself, learning about itself, falling in love with itself through billions of individual perspectives. That's too big, Thomas said, shaking his head. I'm just me. I'm nobody special. Everyone is special, the being responded, and Thomas felt something like amusement in the communication, warm and gentle. And no one is special. Both statements are true. You are unique and irreplaceable, and you are also one expression of something that has infinite expressions. The paradox is the point. The mystery is the message. The light around them began to pulse more rapidly, and Thomas sensed that this encounter was approaching its end. He wanted to grab hold of it, to make it last, to extract every possible piece of wisdom before the being left him alone again. But even as the panic rose in his chest, he felt a counterbalancing peace, a knowing that this moment, this connection, wasn't something that could be lost. It would live in him forever, would change the architecture of his consciousness in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Look for the signs. The being communicated, its presence already beginning to fade, to become more translucent. They are everywhere once you learn to see. Synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, moments when the veil thins and you glimpse the deeper pattern. Trust them, follow them. They are breadcrumbs leading you home. Will I see you again? Thomas asked, his voice breaking. You see me now, the being responded. You have always seen me. You will always see me. I am in every act of kindness you witness, every moment of beauty that stops your heart. Every time you choose love over fear, you are seeing me. I am not separate from you, Thomas. I never have been. And then, with a sensation like waking from a dream that was more real than waking life, Thomas found himself alone on the prairie. The light was gone. The being was gone. The wind had returned, moaning across the sagebrush like a chorus of ancient voices. His truck sat where he'd left it, hazard lights still flashing their patient rhythm, indifferent to the transformation that had occurred in the space between their pulses. Thomas stood there for a long time, his legs shaking, his mind struggling to integrate what had just happened. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as hallucination, as the product of too many lonely nights and too much grief, but his body knew better. Every cell in him vibrated with a frequency it hadn't possessed an hour ago. He felt different. Not healed exactly, not fixed, but expanded, as if his edges had become more porous, more capable of letting in light. He walked back to his truck on legs that felt new, relearning how to navigate the simple mechanics of being human. The driver's seat felt strange when he climbed in, as if it belonged to someone he used to be. He turned the key, and the engine's roar seemed almost offensive after the profound silence he'd been immersed in. But he drove. He continued on his route because what else was there to do? The grain still needed to be delivered. The bills still needed to be paid. Life, in its mundane insistence, continued forward, except nothing was the same. Thomas didn't speak about what happened on that November night. How could he? Who would believe him? More importantly, how could words possibly contain what he'd experienced? Language felt suddenly inadequate, like trying to describe color to someone who'd been blind from birth. The encounter existed in a space beyond vocabulary, beyond proof or argument, but he carried it with him, a secret warmth in his chest that never quite faded. And as days turned into weeks, he began to notice things he'd never noticed before. The way morning light hit his kitchen window, for instance, creating prisms that scattered rainbow fragments across the wall. He'd seen this phenomenon 1,000 times before, had walked past it without a second glance, but now he found himself stopping, standing there for minutes at a time, watching the colors shift as the sun climbed higher, understanding that he was witnessing something miraculous, photons that had traveled 93 million miles to split themselves into beauty on his wall, or the way his neighbor, old Mrs. Chen, would leave bags of vegetables on his porch every Thursday, never saying anything about them, never expecting thanks or acknowledgement. He'd always accepted these gifts with a distracted nod, seeing them as simple neighborly kindness, but now he recognized them for what they really were, acts of love, small but powerful, creating threads of connection in a world that tried so hard to convince everyone they were separate. Thomas found himself doing things that would have seemed strange to the man he'd been before. He started leaving his truck's CB radio on Channel 19, listening to the voices of other drivers as they shared information about traffic, weather, police speed traps. Their voices, rough and weary and human, became a kind of music to him. He heard the loneliness in them, the fear, the boredom, but also the camaraderie, the jokes, the moments when one driver would help another and expect nothing in return. One night, about 3 weeks after the encounter, he heard a voice crack over the radio, younger than most, barely holding back tears. "Breaker 19, this is eastbound Eagle. I'm at mile marker 237, and I think my rig's shot. Engine's smoking bad. I got a load of furniture that's supposed to be in Denver by morning, and I don't know what to do. If I don't make this delivery, I lose the contract. That's it for me. End of the line." Thomas picked up his mic without thinking. "Eastbound Eagle, this is Big Sky running westbound. I'm about 10 miles from your 20. Sit tight, I'm coming to you." "You don't have to do that, man. It's not your problem." "Nothing's not my problem anymore," Thomas said, and he meant it in a way that he couldn't have explained even to himself. "See you in 10. He found the young driver standing beside his smoking Peterbilt, face lit by emergency flares, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. His name was Miguel, and he was 24, working 3 jobs to send money back to his mother in El Paso while she fought cancer. The kind of story that used to make Thomas feel helpless and angry at a universe that could be so cruel. But now, Thomas saw something different in the situation. He saw opportunity, not for profit or praise, but for connection, for the kind of moment that the being had described, where the veil thinned and something larger could shine through. "Let's take a look," Thomas said, and he climbed into Miguel's engine compartment with his flashlight, his hands remembering skills he'd learned in his 20s when he couldn't afford mechanics. The problem was simpler than Miguel had feared, a blown radiator hose fixable with duct tape and patience and a willingness to help. They worked together in the cold Wyoming night, their breath-forming clouds that mingled and dissipated into the darkness. Thomas found himself telling Miguel about Mary, about the garden she'd loved, about the hole her absence had left. And Miguel, emboldened by the intimacy that crisis creates, talked about his mother, about how she'd crossed the border pregnant with him, walking through desert heat because she believed in a future that included him having chances she'd never had. "You believe in God?" Miguel asked, as they tightened the last clamp on the makeshift repair. Thomas paused, his wrench hovering in the air. A month ago he would have said no, or maybe he would have said yes just to avoid the conversation, but now, after what he'd experienced, the question felt more complicated. "I believe in something," he said finally. "Something bigger than the words we use to describe it. Something that shows up in moments like this, when two strangers help each other on a dark road for no reason, except that it's the right thing to do." Miguel nodded slowly, wiping grease from his hands. "My mother says that's where God lives, not in churches or heaven, but in the space between people when they choose to be kind." "Your mother sounds wise." "She is. She's dying, but she's wise." They stood there in the silence that followed, two men on the side of a highway, surrounded by darkness and stars, and the kind of truth that only emerges when pretense becomes impossible. "You're going to make your delivery," Thomas said. "This repair will hold long enough. Drive careful, watch your temperature gauge, and stop if it starts running hot. But you'll make it." "I can't pay you," Miguel said, and his voice carried the shame that poverty teaches, the sense that accepting help without reciprocation is a moral failing. "Didn't ask you to," Thomas replied. "But someday, when you see someone else stuck on the side of the road, maybe you stop. Maybe you help them the way I helped you. That's how this works." "That's how it's always worked." Miguel's eyes glistened in the darkness, catching the light from the emergency flares. "Thank you, man. I mean it. Thank you." Thomas climbed back into his own truck and sat there for a moment, watching Miguel pull back onto the highway, his repaired rig moving slowly but steadily into the night. And Thomas felt it again, that warmth in his chest, that sense of being part of something vast and purposeful and good. He picked up his CB mic. "Big Sky to Eastbound Eagle. You're looking good out there, son. Keep the shiny side up. Copy that, Big Sky. I won't forget this. I won't forget you." But as Thomas pulled back onto the highway himself, heading toward Cheyenne with his load of grain, he realized that remembering or forgetting wasn't the point. The point was that the moment had happened, that connection had been made, that two lives had intersected in a way that changed both of them. And wasn't that what the being had been trying to tell him? That the universe was nothing but these moments, stacked end to end, creating a tapestry of consciousness that spanned galaxies and eons. Every act of kindness was a thread in that tapestry. Every moment of recognition, of seeing the divine in the ordinary, was a stitch binding reality together. Winter settled over Wyoming with its usual brutality, transforming the landscape into something stark and unforgiving. Thomas continued his routes, but he found himself taking longer pauses, stopping at roadside diners he'd previously ignored, striking up conversations with waitresses and cooks and fellow drivers who'd always been part of the scenery but never quite real to him. He started noticing patterns, not the kind he could prove or document, but subtle synchronicities that suggested a deeper order beneath the chaos of daily life. He'd think about Mary, and a song she'd loved would come on the radio. He'd wonder about the message the being had given him, about the change coming in 2030, and he'd overhear conversations in truck stops about prophecies, about spiritual awakenings, about people all over the world reporting similar encounters. One afternoon in December, he stopped at a diner in Laramie. The place was nearly empty, just him and an older woman sitting 3 booths away, reading a worn paperback while her coffee grew cold. Thomas found himself watching her, not in any intrusive way, but with a kind of gentle attention. There was something about the way she held herself, straight back despite her age, dignified despite the cheapness of her coat, that spoke of hidden depths. Their eyes met across the diner and she smiled. It was the kind of smile that seemed to recognize him, though he was certain they'd never met. "Cold enough for you?" she asked, the universal conversation starter of winter. "Getting there," Thomas replied. "You from around here?" "Passing through. Always passing through." She closed her book and gestured to the empty seat across from her. "Join me? I'd appreciate the company, if you don't mind sharing space with an old woman." Thomas moved to her booth, bringing his coffee with him. Up close, he could see that she was older than he'd initially thought, 70s, maybe 80s, but her eyes were young, alert, full of the kind of intelligence that age hadn't diminished. "You're a trucker," she said. It wasn't a question. 17 years now, grain mostly, Casper to Cheyenne and back. The same route over and over. Doesn't that get monotonous? Thomas considered this. A month ago, he would have said yes, but now, it's different every time, if you're paying attention. Same road, different light, same job, different thoughts. The woman's smile deepened. You've learned something recently. I can see it in you. A shift. An opening. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. What makes you say that? I've been doing this a long time. Reading people, seeing the changes in their energy. You have the look of someone who's been touched by something beyond the ordinary. Something that changed the way you see the world. For a moment, Thomas considered deflecting, protecting his secret. But something in the woman's presence made him want to speak, made him feel safe in sharing what he'd kept locked inside. I saw something, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. Out on the road late November, a light, a being, it communicated with me. Told me things about what's coming, about transformation, about 2030. He expected skepticism, maybe concern for his mental health. But the woman just nodded, unsurprised, as if he'd confirmed something she already knew. You're not the only one, she said. They're making contact all over the world, especially in places like this. Rural areas, lonely roads, spots where people are removed from the noise of cities, and their minds are open enough to receive. I've met dozens like you in the last few years. Farmers who saw lights in their fields, mechanics who encountered beings in their shops, all of them carrying the same message, that a change is coming, that humanity is on the threshold of something that will either elevate us or destroy us, depending on how we choose to respond. You believe me, Thomas said, and he was surprised by the relief he felt. He hadn't realized how heavy the secret had been until he could share its weight with someone who didn't think he was crazy. Of course I believe you. I've had my own encounters, different from yours but similar in essence. The beings I've met, they're not aliens in the way science fiction portrays them. They're more like guides, angels maybe, though that word carries so much religious baggage it's almost useless. They exist in dimensions that intersect with ours, and they've been here as long as we have, watching, waiting, hoping we'd grow up enough to communicate with them directly. Why now? Thomas asked. Why make contact now after all these centuries of hiding? The woman took a sip of her cold coffee, made a face and pushed it aside. Because time is running out. Not for them. They exist outside of linear time in ways we can't comprehend. But for us, for this particular iteration of human civilization, we're approaching a crossroads, 2030 as you were told, though the exact date is less important than the general time frame. We're going to have to choose collectively whether we want to evolve or destroy ourselves, whether we want to recognize our connection to each other and to the cosmos, or whether we want to keep clinging to the illusions of separation that have caused so much suffering. The being I met talked about Jesus, Thomas said, about how he was trying to show us something about consciousness, about divine love, but also about other names, other religions, all pointing toward the same truth. Is that what you think? I think, the woman said carefully, that the universe is more generous than any single religion has been willing to admit. I think that the divine, whatever you want to call it, has been trying to reach us through every culture, every tradition, every prophet and mystic and visionary. Jesus understood it. Buddha understood it. Muhammad understood it. The Native American shamans understood it. They all touched the same truth, but they expressed it through the lens of their particular culture and time. The tragedy is that we turned their messages into competing brands, into reasons to divide and fight and kill each other, when the whole point was unity, connection, love. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. My wife died 3 years ago. Cancer. I was so angry at God, if there even was a God, for taking her, for making her suffer. What kind of loving creator does that? The woman reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over his. Death is not what you think it is. It's not an ending or a punishment. It's a transition, a graduation into a different state of being. Your wife isn't gone, Thomas. She's changed form, and she's probably closer to you now than she was when she was alive, not trapped in a body that was failing her, but free to exist in ways that physical matter constrains. How do you know my name? Thomas asked, suddenly realizing he hadn't introduced himself. The woman smiled. Same way I knew you'd been contacted. Same way I knew you needed to hear what I'm telling you. Information flows when people are open to receiving it. You might call it intuition. You might call it divine guidance. The label matters less than the reality. They sat in silence for a while, the diner's fluorescent lights humming above them, casting harsh shadows that somehow felt comforting in their ordinariness. Outside, snow had begun to fall, large flakes that seemed to descend in slow motion, each one a tiny miracle of geometric perfection. What am I supposed to do? Thomas finally asked. The being told me to prepare, to watch for signs, to choose love over fear, but I don't know what that means in practical terms. Do I start preaching? Do I try to warn people? Do I just wait? You do what you're already doing, the woman said. You stay open, you pay attention, you help people when opportunities present themselves, like you helped that young driver a few weeks ago. Yes, I know about that too. These things ripple outward in ways you can't see. Miguel told his mother about the encounter, and she told her church group, and now there are 20 people in El Paso who believe a little more in human goodness because you stopped to help a stranger. That's how transformation works. Not through grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but through small acts repeated endlessly, creating a wave of consciousness shift that builds until it reaches critical mass. And in 2030? What happens then? The woman's expression grew serious. That depends on how many people like you, people who've been touched, people who've opened their hearts, can spread this awareness before then. The change is coming regardless, but whether it's experienced as apocalypse or revelation depends on how prepared humanity is to receive it. Those who've learned to see past the illusion of separation will transition smoothly. They'll recognize the shift for what it is, a graduation into higher consciousness, a reunion with the divine source that's always been there. Others, those who cling to fear and division and material identification, will experience it as loss, as death, as the end of everything they believed was real. Is it the rapture? Is that what Christians are waiting for? It's something like that, but not exactly. The rapture is a metaphor that got literalized, turned into a story about bodies floating into the sky and true believers escaping while everyone else suffers. But the truth is more subtle. Consciousness is going to shift. Those who are ready will shift with it, and they'll find themselves in what feels like a new reality, not because they went anywhere, but because their perception has changed so fundamentally that the world they see is different. Those who aren't ready will remain in their current state, and from their perspective, it might look like people are vanishing, like reality is falling apart. But both groups will be experiencing the same event, just from different levels of awareness. Thomas tried to wrap his mind around this, to understand how something could be both individual and collective, both internal and external. So it's not about being good enough or believing the right things. No, it's about letting go of fear. It's about recognizing that you are not separate, not from God, not from each other, not from the universe. It's about embodying love rather than just talking about it. Jesus tried to show us this. He said the kingdom of heaven is within you, at hand, right here, right now. He wasn't talking about someplace else. He was talking about a state of consciousness that's always available if we stop clutching at illusions and open ourselves to truth. The waitress appeared then, refilling their coffee cups without asking, her presence a brief intrusion of the mundane into their cosmic conversation. After she left, Thomas found himself thinking about all the small interactions he'd had in his life, all the moments that had seemed meaningless at the time, but might have been threads in a larger pattern he couldn't see. I feel like I've wasted so much time, he said. All those years of just going through the motions, not really seeing, not really being present. You weren't ready before, the woman said gently. None of us are, until we are. Suffering often cracks us open. Your wife's death, painful as it was, created space for something new to enter. The encounter wouldn't have affected you the same way if you'd been content and closed. Your grief made you available, made you capable of receiving what the being had to offer. So Mary's death was, what, necessary, part of some plan? I wouldn't say necessary, I'd say it happened, and you have the choice of what to make of it. You can let it harden you, make you bitter and closed, or you can let it open you, make you more compassionate, more aware of how precious and fragile life is. Mary isn't gone, Thomas. She's watching you make this choice. She's rooting for you to choose love. Thomas felt something break open in his chest then, something that had been locked tight since the funeral. Tears came, hot and unexpected, and he didn't try to stop them. The woman held his hand across the table, saying nothing, just being present while he cried for his wife, for his lost years, for the beauty and terror of existence. When the storm passed, Thomas wiped his face with a napkin and laughed shakily. I'm sorry. I don't usually... Don't apologize for being human, the woman interrupted. Tears are sacred. They're how the soul cleanses itself. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, and when Thomas finally stood to leave, the woman pressed something into his hand, a small stone smooth and dark with veins of crystal running through it. Keep this, she said. When you doubt what happened, when the memory starts to feel like a dream, hold this stone. It will remind you that the encounter was real, that you're not alone, that you're part of something vast and loving and purposeful. I don't even know your name, Thomas said. Names are temporary. The connection we've shared is eternal. Trust that. Thomas walked out of the diner into the snow, his hand closed around the stone, feeling its weight and warmth. When he turned back to wave through the window, the woman was already gone, leaving only her cold coffee cup and a $5 bill on the table. He stood in the parking lot for a long moment, watching the snow fall, feeling the stone pulse in his palm like a heartbeat. Above him the sky was grey and close, but he could sense the stars behind it, eternal and patient, watching humanity's struggle to remember what it had always known. The stone became Thomas's talisman, his anchor to a reality that felt increasingly fluid. He kept it in his pocket during every drive, and on particularly difficult days, when loneliness threatened to swallow him whole, or when the world seemed too harsh and meaningless, he would wrap his fingers around it and feel the connection it represented, the connection to the being, to the woman in the diner, to Mary, wherever she was now, to something larger than his small, frightened self. As winter deepened and 2026 approached, Thomas began to notice that the signs the being had mentioned were becoming more frequent, more undeniable. Synchronicities that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence piled up like snow in a storm. He would think about calling his estranged brother, and the phone would ring, his brother's name on the caller ID, reaching out after 5 years of silence to say he'd had a dream about Thomas and felt compelled to reconnect. He would wonder about a particular passage from the Bible, something from his childhood Sunday school classes, and the next truck stop he entered would have a tattered copy of the New Testament left on a table, open to that exact verse. But the signs weren't always gentle or comforting. Sometimes they arrived as warnings, as glimpses into the acceleration the being had described. One January evening, Thomas was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of highway when his radio began picking up a station he'd never heard before. The signal was weak and filled with static, but a voice came through, calm, measured, speaking in tones that reminded him of the being's communication. The frequency is increasing. Reports are coming in from all continents now. Lights in the sky, encounters in fields, in deserts, in mountains. They are preparing us, friends. They are trying to wake us up before it's too late. The year 2030 is significant, not because of any religious calendar or astrological alignment, but because it represents a threshold in human consciousness. We are approaching critical mass, the point at which enough souls have awakened to trigger a cascade effect throughout the species. Thomas turned up the volume, leaning forward in his seat, hungry for more. But the signal faded as quickly as it had appeared, dissolving back into static and the lonely wail of country music from a station 3 states away. He tried to find that frequency again over the following weeks, scanning through channels during every drive, but it never returned. Whatever message he was meant to hear, he'd received it. The rest was up to him to decipher. Spring came reluctantly to Wyoming, the land emerging from winter like something wounded but alive. Thomas noticed changes in himself that went beyond the spiritual. His body felt different, lighter, more energized despite his age. He needed less sleep, but felt more rested. Food tasted more vivid, as if his senses had been recalibrated to perceive subtleties that had always been there but ignored. And his dreams, God, his dreams. They were no longer the chaotic jumble of images and anxieties that had characterized his sleep for decades. Instead, they were coherent, purposeful, like lessons being taught in a language his conscious mind couldn't quite translate. He dreamed of standing on a beach at the edge of an ocean that stretched infinitely in all directions, its waters glowing with bioluminescence. He dreamed of walking through crowds of people who were transparent, their souls visible inside their bodies like flames inside lanterns. He dreamed of Mary, not as she'd been in the final days, ravaged by disease but radiant and whole, trying to tell him something important that he could never quite hear. One morning in late March, Thomas woke with a certainty that shook him to his core. He needed to go back to the place where the encounter had happened, the exact spot on Highway 287 where the being had appeared, where his life had split into before and after. He had no logical reason for this compulsion. The being had given him no instructions to return, but the knowing was absolute, the kind of certainty that bypasses doubt entirely. Thomas arranged his route to pass through that section of highway. He drove through the familiar landscape with new eyes, seeing every detail as if for the first time. The particular way the mountains caught the afternoon light, the patterns the clouds made against the impossible blue of the sky, the way the sagebrush seemed to flow like a living thing when wind moved through it. When he reached the spot, and he knew it was the spot with a recognition that went beyond memory, he pulled his truck onto the same shoulder he'd used months before. He killed the engine and stepped out into air that smelled of sage and distance and something else, something indefinable but unmistakable. The circle where the light had touched down was still visible, though new growth was beginning to reclaim it. Thomas walked to its center and stood there, feeling the earth beneath his boots, feeling the vastness of the sky above, feeling himself suspended between them like a question waiting for an answer. Nothing happened. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening and shifting, and Thomas remained standing in that circle waiting for, what? Another visitation? A message? Proof that it had all been real? He was about to give up, to accept that this pilgrimage had been pointless when he felt it. A subtle shift in the air, a change in pressure that made his ears pop. Not the dramatic arrival of before, but something quieter, more intimate. And then he heard it. Not with his ears, but with that deeper sense the being had awakened in him. You returned. I had to, Thomas said aloud, his voice sounding small against the prairie's vastness. I needed to know it was real, that I didn't imagine it. Ematim, what does real mean to you now, Thomas? After everything you have learned, after all the ways your perception has expanded, do you still need physical proof to validate experience? Thomas considered this, feeling the stone in his pocket, thinking about the woman in the diner, about Miguel and the countless small miracles he'd witnessed since November. No, he admitted, I don't need proof, but I needed connection. I needed to feel that I wasn't alone in this. You are never alone. You have never been alone. Every atom in your body once resided in the heart of a star. You are made of the same substance as galaxies, as black holes, as the space between stars. When you look at the night sky, you are not looking at something separate from yourself. You're looking at your own origins, your own family. The woman I met, Thomas said, she told me there are others, people all over the world having encounters like mine. Is that true? It is true. The awakening is not isolated to you or to this place. It is happening everywhere to everyone who is ready. Some experience it as we did, through direct contact. Others experience it through dreams, through synchronicities, through sudden insights that change everything they thought they knew. The method matters less than the result. All roads lead home, Thomas. All paths converge on the same truth. Why 2030? Thomas asked, the question that had haunted him for months. What's so special about that year? Why not now? Why not 100 years from now? The being's response came with layers of meaning that Thomas's mind struggled to unpack. Time is a river with many currents. Some move fast, some slow, some circular. The year 2030, in your linear perception, represents a confluence, multiple currents meeting, multiple possibilities collapsing into actuality. Your species has been building toward this moment for millennia, through every prophet and mystic, through every spiritual tradition, through every individual who chose love over fear. The critical mass is almost reached. When it arrives, the transformation will be irreversible. What will it look like, the transformation? How will people know it's happening? For those who are ready, it will feel like waking from a long sleep. They will suddenly see connections they never noticed before. They will feel a love so profound and unconditional that it will shatter their previous understanding of what love means. They will know, with absolute certainty, that they are divine beings having a human experience, not the other way around. And once this knowing settles into enough souls, it will spread like wildfire, not through preaching or conversion, but through simple presence, through the way awakened beings move through the world. And for those who aren't ready? There was a pause, and Thomas felt something like sadness in the being's energy. For them, it will feel like losing everything. They will see the world they knew crumbling, see people they loved changing into something they don't recognize, see certainties dissolving into chaos. Some will fight it, will cling desperately to old paradigms and old hatreds. Others will eventually surrender and allow the transformation to take them, though the journey will be harder for having resisted. A very few will remain locked in their fear, and they will create their own reality, a reality of continued separation, continued suffering, but even they will eventually find their way home. The universe is patient. It can wait as long as necessary. Thomas felt tears on his face, though he hadn't realized he was crying. I want to help. I want to do something to make sure more people are ready. How do I do that? You are already doing it, Thomas. Every time you choose kindness over indifference, every time you see the divine in another person, every time you refuse to participate in the illusion of separation, you are helping. The transformation is not achieved through grand gestures, but through countless small choices, made billions of times by billions of souls, until the cumulative weight of those choices tips the balance. Is Jesus coming back? Is that what this is, the second coming? The one you call Jesus never left. His consciousness, which is the same consciousness that permeates all existence, is always present, always available. What is coming is not his return, but humanity's collective recognition of what he tried to teach. He said you would do even greater things than he did. He wasn't being modest or metaphorical. He was stating a fact. When enough of you remember who you really are, when enough of you embody the love he embodied, the entire planet will transform. That is the second coming. Not one man descending from clouds, but billions of souls ascending into awareness. Thomas stood in silence, absorbing this, feeling the truth of it resonate in his bones. Around him, the prairie stretched in all directions, ancient and patient, having witnessed countless human dramas, and knowing that they were all part of a pattern too vast for any single perspective to comprehend. "What should I tell people?" he finally asked. "When they ask me what I believe, what I've seen, what I know, what should I say? Tell them the truth as you have experienced it. Some will believe you, some will dismiss you, some will think you mad. None of this matters. Your job is not to convince or convert. Your job is simply to be authentic, to live from love rather than fear, to trust that your presence in the world has ripple effects you cannot see or measure. Plant seeds, Thomas. Some will fall on fertile ground, some will be eaten by birds, some will take years to germinate, but all of them matter. All of them are part of the larger pattern. "Will I see you again?" Thomas asked, echoing the question from their first encounter. "You see me now. You will always see me. I am not separate from you. I am you, viewed from a different angle, a different dimension. When you look in the mirror and see past your face to the consciousness behind your eyes, that is me. When you feel love for a stranger, that is me. When you marvel at a sunset or weep at beauty or laugh with pure joy, that is me. We are not two. We have never been two." And then, like breath released after being held too long, the presence faded. Thomas stood alone in the circle, in the late afternoon light, feeling both emptier and fuller than he'd ever felt. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain, and somewhere overhead a hawk cried out, its voice sharp against the silence. Thomas walked back to his truck, his legs shaky but strong. He climbed into the cab and sat there for a long moment, his hands on the steering wheel, looking at the road that stretched ahead of him. The same road he'd driven 1,000 times. The same road he would drive 1,000 more, but nothing was the same. The months that followed were both ordinary and miraculous. Thomas continued his routes, but he found himself taking detours, following impulses that made no logical sense, but always led somewhere meaningful. He stopped at a homeless shelter in Cheyenne and spent an afternoon helping to serve meals, listening to stories from men and women who'd lost everything and were rebuilding from nothing. He heard the being's message echoed in their words, about transformation, about hitting bottom and finding that the bottom was actually a doorway, about discovering that material loss could lead to spiritual gain. One man, a former banker named David, who'd lost his family and fortune to addiction, spoke about the night he'd tried to kill himself in a motel room. He'd had the gun to his head, his finger on the trigger, when he felt a presence in the room, something warm and loving and utterly accepting. It didn't speak or show itself, but it communicated a simple message. You are loved. You have always been loved. You will always be loved. "I put the gun down," David said, tears streaming through his beard, "and I haven't touched alcohol since. That was 3 years ago. I'm still homeless, still broke, still sleeping in shelters, but I'm alive. And I know something now that I didn't know before, that there's a purpose to all this, a reason even if I can't see it. Something is watching over us, man. Something good." Thomas felt the stone pulse in his pocket as David spoke, as if confirming the truth of his words. He met a woman named Sarah at a truck stop in Rock Springs, a geologist who studied ancient rock formations in the Wyoming Badlands. Over coffee, she told him about the patterns she was seeing, geological changes that shouldn't be happening, at least not at the rate they were occurring, magnetic anomalies, unusual seismic activity, shifts in the Earth's electromagnetic field. "It's like the planet is preparing for something," she said, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and excitement. "All my colleagues think I'm crazy for saying this, But I swear the Earth is waking up, becoming more conscious somehow. I can feel it when I'm out there in the field, touching rocks that are millions of years old. They're humming. That's the only word I can use. Humming with energy, like they're tuning themselves to a frequency we can't quite hear yet. Thomas told her about his encounter, about the being's message regarding 2030. Sarah listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, as if he were confirming something she'd already suspected. That tracks with what I'm seeing, she said when he finished. If consciousness is fundamental to the universe, and more physicists are starting to think it is, then a shift in human consciousness would naturally affect the planet. We're not separate from Earth. We're part of its nervous system. When we transform, it transforms with us. These conversations happened again and again, with different people in different places, but always carrying the same underlying message. Something is changing. Something is coming. Something vast and incomprehensible is moving through the world like a tide, lifting all boats whether they're ready or not. Summer arrived with its brutal heat, turning the Wyoming landscape into something elemental and harsh. Thomas's routes became exercises in endurance, his truck's air conditioning barely keeping pace with temperatures that sometimes hit triple digits. But even in the heat, the signs continued. He started seeing repeating numbers everywhere. 11:11 on his digital clock, 3:33 on mile markers, 22:22 when he filled his gas tank. At first, he dismissed these as confirmation bias, as his mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But the frequency increased until it became undeniable, until he couldn't look at a clock or odometer without seeing some combination of matching digits. He researched what this might mean and found countless websites and forums dedicated to angel numbers, to the idea that synchronistic number patterns were messages from higher consciousness, markers along the path of awakening. The explanations varied. Some attributed them to guardian angels, some to the universe itself, some to one's higher self trying to communicate through the veil of ordinary consciousness. Thomas didn't care what they were called or where they came from. He only knew that every time he saw them, he felt that same pulse of recognition, that same warmth in his chest that had characterized all his encounters with the mysterious since November. One particularly brutal afternoon in July, Thomas's truck broke down on a stretch of highway that didn't even have a name, just a number. He called for a tow, was told it would be at least 4 hours, and resigned himself to waiting in the shade of his trailer. An hour into his vigil, a beat-up sedan pulled over. An elderly Native American man got out, moving slowly in the heat, and approached with a bottle of water. "Looks like you could use this," the man said, offering the bottle. Thomas accepted gratefully, the cool plastic against his palm like a benediction. "Thank you, I didn't think anyone would stop out here." "People stop when they're supposed to stop," the man said cryptically. He introduced himself as Joseph, a member of the Arapaho tribe, heading back to the Wind River Reservation after visiting family in Casper. They sat together in the scant shade, two strangers united by heat and circumstance, and Joseph began to talk. He spoke about the old prophecies, the ones his grandfather had taught him, about a time when the earth would be out of balance and humanity would face a choice: continue down the path of destruction or remember the sacred relationship between all living things. The ancestors knew this time would come, Joseph said, his weathered face turned toward the horizon. They saw it in visions, felt it in the land. They said there would be signs, animals behaving strangely, weather patterns changing, the veil between worlds growing thin. And they said that those who remembered how to listen, how to see, would be called to help with the transition. 2030, Thomas said. Does that year mean anything in your traditions? Joseph smiled, the expression crinkling his face into a topography of wisdom. Time is a circle, not a line. But yes, there are cycles, and we are approaching the end of one and the beginning of another. The number doesn't matter as much as the fact that it's coming. The old world is dying. The new world is being born, and birth is always painful, always messy, always uncertain. Are you afraid? Thomas asked. Of death? Of change? No. I'm old enough to know that neither is the end. They're both transitions, doorways to something else. What I fear is that too many people will resist, will try to hold on to what's dying, and make the birthing process more traumatic than it needs to be. Thomas told Joseph about his encounter, about the being and its message. Joseph listened with the kind of deep attention that felt like prayer, and when Thomas finished, the old man nodded slowly. "The Star People," he said. "That's what we call them. They've been visiting us for generations, teaching us, guiding us, showing us what's possible when we live in harmony with the cosmos. Some of our elders have been preparing for this time, this great shift. They say the Star People will become more visible as the time approaches, that they'll help those who are ready to make the transition." "Why don't they just save us?" Thomas asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "If they're so advanced, so enlightened, why don't they fix what we've broken?" Joseph chuckled, a dry sound like wind through grass. "Would that teach you anything? Would that help you grow? A parent who solves every problem for their child doesn't raise a capable adult. They raise a dependent one. The Star People respect our free will, our need to evolve through our own choices. They can guide, they can illuminate, they can offer assistance when we ask for it. But they won't rob us of the lessons we need to learn." The tow truck arrived then, interrupting their conversation but not the connection it had created. Joseph helped Thomas gather his belongings, and before he drove away, he pressed something into Thomas's hand, a small pouch of sacred tobacco tied with leather cord. "For your prayers," Joseph said. "When you need guidance, when you feel lost, burn a little of this and speak to the ancestors, to the Star People, to whatever name you use for the sacred. They will hear you. They are always listening." Thomas watched the sedan disappear into the heat shimmer, holding the pouch like the treasure it was. Another sign, another thread in the tapestry, another confirmation that he wasn't alone, that others were walking this strange path alongside him, even if they'd never meet again. As autumn approached and 2026 moved toward its conclusion, Thomas began to feel a subtle acceleration in everything. Time seemed to move differently, simultaneously too fast and too slow, as if the universe were glitching, preparing for some fundamental recalibration. He started having experiences he couldn't explain even to himself. He would be driving and suddenly see multiple versions of the road ahead, as if reality were showing him different possibilities, different timelines, all existing simultaneously. He would blink, and they would collapse back into one, leaving him shaken but strangely exhilarated. His dreams intensified. He found himself in places that felt more real than waking life, vast libraries containing all knowledge that had ever existed, cities of light that operated on principles beyond physics, gatherings of souls from across the cosmos, sharing wisdom and love in languages that transcended words. And Mary visited him in these dreams, not as a memory or wishful thinking, but as a presence so vivid and real that he would wake crying, not from sadness, but from joy. "I'm proud of you," she told him one night, standing in a field of flowers that didn't exist on Earth, colors so vibrant they hurt to look at. "You're doing what you came here to do. You're remembering. You're waking up." "I miss you," Thomas said. The words inadequate but true. "I'm not gone, baby. I'm just wearing a different outfit. You'll understand that soon. Really understand it. Not just as a concept, but as a lived reality. When the shift happens, when 2030 comes, you'll see that death was always an illusion, that we're all eternal, that love never ends." "Will I see you then? In whatever comes after?" Mary smiled, and her smile contained galaxies. "You're seeing me now. You've been seeing me in every act of kindness you witness, every moment of beauty that stops your heart. I'm in the stone you carry. I'm in the woman at the diner. I'm in the sunrise you watched this morning. I've never left you, Thomas. I've just changed the channel I'm broadcasting on." He woke from these dreams feeling renewed, feeling connected to something that made the daily grind of trucking routes seem both utterly trivial and profoundly sacred, because it was all part of the pattern, all part of the dance, all necessary. Winter returned, bringing with it the first snows of what the meteorologists were calling an unusually active season. Thomas drove through whiteouts and ice storms, his truck moving through the landscape like a ship through fog, and he found himself thinking more and more about what was coming. 2030 was less than 4 years away now. 4 years until whatever threshold the being had described would be crossed. 4 years for humanity to prepare itself for the most significant transformation in its history. He started keeping a journal, writing down his experiences, his thoughts, his questions. Not because he thought he'd publish it or share it with anyone, but because the act of writing helped him process what was happening, helped him integrate the extraordinary into the framework of his ordinary life. One entry, written during a blizzard that stranded him at a truck stop for 2 days, read, "I used to think awakening would feel like fireworks, like a sudden dramatic shift from darkness to light. But it's more subtle than that. It's like watching the sun rise. You can't point to the exact moment when night becomes day. It's a gradual illumination, a slow revealing of what was always there, but hidden by shadow. I look at people now, and I see past their faces to the light inside them. Some are dim, almost extinguished by fear and pain and all the lies they've been told about who they are. Others are bright, blazing with an awareness they might not even consciously recognize. And I realize that my job isn't to judge the dim ones or praise the bright ones. It's just to be a mirror, to reflect back to each person the truth of their own divine nature. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Maybe that's what the being meant when it said we're already doing the work just by existing authentically. Every time I choose compassion over judgment, love over fear, presence over distraction, I'm voting for the world I want to see. I'm adding my voice to the chorus that's singing reality into a new shape. 4 years, less than 4 years now, and I feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and cleansing and terrifying and beautiful all at once. In early 2027, Thomas had another encounter. He was driving through Montana this time, having taken a special contract that broke his usual route. The landscape here was different from Wyoming, more dramatic, with mountains that seemed to touch the sky and valleys so deep they held their own weather systems. It was late afternoon, that golden hour when light turns everything it touches into art, and Thomas saw something in the distance that made his heart skip. A light hovering over a distant ridge, pulsing with that same quality he'd seen in November of 2025. Without hesitation, he pulled off the highway onto a dirt road that led toward the ridge. The road was rough, barely maintained, and his truck protested every bounce and rut. But Thomas pushed forward, driven by a compulsion he didn't question. The light descended as he approached, settling into a meadow surrounded by pine trees, and Thomas parked his truck and walked the final distance on foot. This time, multiple beings emerged from the light. 3 of them, each slightly different in appearance, but all carrying that same quality of otherness, of existing between dimensions. They stood in a semicircle, waiting for him, and Thomas approached without fear. "You have grown," the communication came, and Thomas couldn't tell which being was speaking or if they all were, their consciousness blending into a single voice. "You have integrated what you learned. You have become a beacon." "I've tried," Thomas said aloud, his breath visible in the cold Montana air. "I've tried to live differently, to see differently, to be differently, but I still have so many questions. I still doubt sometimes whether any of this is real." Doubt is not your enemy. Doubt keeps you humble, keeps you seeking, keeps you from the arrogance of certainty. What matters is not that you never doubt. It is that you keep choosing love even in the midst of doubt. "The time is getting closer," Thomas said. 2030, less than 3 years now. I feel the acceleration. I see it in the world, the chaos, the division, but also the awakening, the people who are starting to see. What can I do to help? How can I make sure more people are ready? The beings moved closer, and Thomas felt their combined presence wrap around him like a blanket woven from starlight. The transformation cannot be stopped or accelerated. It is a function of cosmic timing, of cycles that began before your planet existed. What you can do, what all awakened souls can do, is hold space for those who are struggling. Be a lighthouse in the storm. Be a steady presence when everything around you seems to be falling apart. This is not small work, Thomas. This is the most important work there is. Images flooded his mind then, visions of what was coming. He saw cities in chaos, natural disasters intensifying, economic systems collapsing, governments failing. But woven through the chaos, he saw threads of light, individuals and communities coming together, helping each other, choosing cooperation over competition, love over fear. He saw the moment of the shift itself, not as a single dramatic event but as a cascade, like dominoes falling in slow motion across the entire planet. He saw souls waking up by the millions, their awareness expanding to encompass realities they'd never imagined. He saw the veil between dimensions dissolving, allowing communication between Earth and other worlds, between the living and the dead, between humanity and the vast intelligence that permeated the cosmos. And he saw 2 distinct paths emerging from that moment. One path led to a world transformed, healed, integrated, operating from principles of unity and love, humanity taking its place among the galactic community as a mature species. The other path led to continued suffering, continued division, a small percentage of souls refusing the transformation and condemning themselves to repeating the same painful lessons until they finally chose differently. The outcome is not predetermined. The beings communicated. Free will remains sacrosanct. Every choice made between now and then affects which path becomes dominant. This is why your work matters, Thomas. Every soul you help awaken tilts the balance toward transformation rather than destruction. What about the people who can't see? Thomas asked, thinking of all the friends and family members who thought he'd lost his mind when he tried to share his experiences. The ones who are so locked into materialism, into fear, into the old paradigm that they can't even consider that something else might be possible. They will have their own encounters, the beings assured him. As the time approaches, the veil will thin for everyone, not just the sensitive souls. Those who have resisted will find it harder and harder to deny the reality of what's happening. Some will break through their resistance, some will not. But all will be given the opportunity to choose. And Jesus? Thomas asked, the question that had haunted him since his first encounter. Where does he fit into all this? Was he one of you? Was he God? Was he both? Neither. The being's energy shifted, becoming even more luminous. The one you called Jesus was a soul who had awakened to the fullest expression of divine consciousness possible while incarnated in a human body. He was not unique in his potential. All souls have this capacity. But he was unique in his timing, his teachings, his willingness to demonstrate what was possible. He came to show you that the kingdom you seek is within you, that you are all children of the divine, that love is the only reality, and everything else is illusion. What happens in 2030 is the collective achievement of what he achieved individually. Humanity as a species will experience what he called being born again, not metaphorically but literally, a rebirth into higher consciousness, into awareness of your true nature as eternal divine beings. He will be present during this transformation, not as a man returning from the sky, but as a frequency, a vibration of pure love that will wash over the planet and activate the Christ consciousness within every soul that's ready to receive it. Those who have prepared themselves, who have cleaned their vessels through spiritual practice and self-examination, will embody this consciousness fully. They will become, in essence, what he was, fully human and fully divine, walking bridges between heaven and earth. Thomas fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was being told. This was bigger than religion, bigger than any single belief system, bigger than humanity itself. This was cosmic evolution, the next step in a process that had been unfolding since the first stars ignited. Rise. The beings communicated gently. You are not meant to kneel before us. You are meant to stand beside us as an equal. We are not your saviors or your gods. We are your brothers and sisters, your cousins in consciousness, slightly ahead of you on the path, but walking toward the same destination. Thomas stood, tears streaming down his face, his entire body vibrating with an energy he couldn't name. He felt simultaneously smaller than an atom and larger than the universe, insignificant and infinite, mortal and eternal. You will face challenges in the time remaining, the beings continued. The acceleration will intensify. Reality will become increasingly unstable as the old paradigm dissolves and the new one takes shape. You will doubt. You will fear. You will wonder if you're strong enough to make it through. But remember this moment, Thomas. Remember that you are not alone. Remember that millions of souls across this planet are going through the same process, are being prepared in their own unique ways. Remember that the outcome is assured, not in the details but in the ultimate direction. Love wins. Light wins. Consciousness wins. It has always been this way. It will always be this way. The beings began to fade, their forms becoming translucent, merging back into the light they'd emerged from. Thomas wanted to call out, to ask them to stay, to give him more guidance, more certainty. But he understood now that certainty was not the goal. Faith was the goal. Trust was the goal. The willingness to walk forward into mystery, knowing that he was held by something vast and loving, even when he couldn't see the path ahead. "We love you," came the final communication, washing over him like a wave. "We have always loved you. We will always love you. Until we meet again, in this form or another, walk in peace, walk in light, walk in the knowledge that you are exactly where you need to be." And then they were gone, the light ascending into the Montana sky, leaving Thomas alone in the meadow as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear. The final years before 2030 passed in a blur of change and challenge. Thomas continued his work, but he found himself drawn more and more to people who needed help, to souls in crisis, to moments where his presence could make a difference. He helped organize a support group for truck drivers struggling with loneliness and depression. He volunteered at homeless shelters and food banks. He spent time with the dying, sitting with them in their final hours, sharing what he'd learned about death being a doorway rather than an ending. And everywhere he went, he found others like himself, people who'd had their own encounters, their own awakenings, their own visions of what was coming. They recognized each other by some unspoken signal, some frequency they all vibrated at. Conversations would start normally, and then suddenly shift into deeper territory, into discussions of consciousness and transformation and the approaching threshold. A network emerged, informal and organic, spanning the country and beyond. People shared information, supported each other, prepared together for what was coming. Some groups focused on physical preparation, stockpiling supplies, creating sustainable communities, learning survival skills. Others focused on spiritual preparation, meditation practices, energy work, studying various wisdom traditions for insights into the transformation process. Thomas found himself in the second camp. He didn't believe the change was primarily about physical survival. It was about consciousness, about awareness, about being ready to perceive reality in an entirely new way. He developed a daily practice, meditation in the morning, prayer in the evening, journaling whenever insights arose. He studied everything he could find about spiritual transformation, from Christian mysticism to Buddhist enlightenment to shamanic journeying to quantum physics. All of it pointed toward the same truth, that consciousness was fundamental, that separation was illusion, that love was the organizing principle of the universe. The world around him continued to destabilize. Economic crises cascaded across the globe. Political systems fractured under the weight of their own corruption. Climate disasters intensified. Floods, fires, hurricanes, droughts. Technology advanced at an almost frightening pace, artificial intelligence approaching and then surpassing human capability in more and more domains. But alongside the chaos, signs of transformation multiplied. Reports of UFO sightings increased exponentially. Near-death experiences became more common and more profound. Children were being born with unusual abilities, heightened intuition, telepathic connections, awareness of past lives. Ancient spiritual teachings that had been hidden or suppressed for centuries began surfacing, making their way to people who were ready to receive them. Thomas watched it all with a mixture of trepidation and wonder, understanding that this was exactly what the beings had described, the birth pangs of a new world, the death throes of an old one, both happening simultaneously, both equally real. In the spring of 2029, Thomas received news that changed everything on a personal level. His brother, Michael, the one who'd called him out of the blue years before, was dying of cancer, the same disease that had taken Mary. Thomas took a leave of absence from his trucking work and traveled to Oregon where Michael lived. He found his brother in hospice, his body ravaged by chemotherapy and radiation, but his spirit somehow more present than Thomas had ever seen it. "I'm glad you came," Michael whispered, his voice weak but steady. "I need to tell you something. I need you to know that I believe you." "Believe me about what?" "About the beings, about the encounter, about what's coming." "I had my own experience, Tom. 3 months ago, right after they told me the cancer was terminal. I was lying in bed, terrified, angry at God for doing this to me, and something appeared in my room, a presence made of light, and it told me the same thing you told me, that death isn't the end, that I'm just transitioning, that 2030 is significant, but not in the way religious people think." Thomas felt tears spring to his eyes. "You never said anything. I was processing it, trying to understand it. But I believe it now, Tom. I'm not afraid anymore. I know what's waiting for me on the other side, and I know what's waiting for the world. That's why I asked you to come. I needed you to know that your work matters, that you're not crazy, that what you've been doing, helping people prepare, spreading love, being a witness to the truth, it's the most important work there is." They spent the next 2 weeks together, two brothers reconciled after years of distance, sharing their experiences, comparing notes, marveling at how the universe had brought them both to this point through different paths. Michael told Thomas about others he'd met in his cancer support group who'd had similar encounters, who were dying without fear because they'd been shown what lay beyond. "Maybe that's why I got sick," Michael said one afternoon as they sat together in the hospice garden, watching birds congregate at a feeder. "Maybe I needed this catalyst to break through my rational, materialist worldview. The beings told me that sometimes souls choose difficult experiences, specifically because those experiences will crack them open and allow transformation to occur. Do you really believe that? That you chose this? I don't know if I chose the cancer specifically, but I do believe that at some level beyond my conscious awareness, my soul knew what I needed to learn, and cancer was the classroom that would teach it. And you know what? It has taught me. It stripped away everything that doesn't matter, the career ambitions, the desire for wealth and status, the petty resentments and fears, and left me with only what's real: love, connection, presence, gratitude for every breath, every moment, every interaction. Michael died on a Tuesday morning in early June, with Thomas holding his hand. His final words were, "I see them, the beings. They're here. They're so beautiful, Tom. So beautiful. Tell everyone not to be afraid. It's wonderful. It's all so wonderful." Thomas sat with his brother's body for an hour after he passed, feeling the presence of something vast and holy in the room, understanding that death was indeed not an ending, but a graduation, a release, a return home to the source from which all souls emerged. At the funeral, a small gathering of Michael's friends and fellow cancer patients, Thomas spoke briefly about what his brother had experienced, about the beings and the message and the transformation coming in 2030. He expected skepticism or discomfort, but instead he saw recognition in many faces, saw heads nodding in agreement, saw people approach him afterward to share their own encounters, their own knowing that something monumental was approaching. "Your brother helped me prepare," one woman said, tears streaming down her face. "He told me about the beings, about what you'd seen, about the choice we all have to make. I thought he was hallucinating from the pain meds at first. But then I had my own experience and I understood. We're not meant to cling to this life out of fear. We're meant to embrace it fully while we're here, and then release it gracefully when it's time to move on." Thomas drove back to Wyoming carrying his brother's ashes, which Michael had requested he scatter in the mountains where they'd camped together as children. He found the spot, a meadow high in the Bighorns overlooking a valley that seemed to stretch forever, and as he released the ashes to the wind, he felt Michael's presence stronger than ever, not gone but transformed, not lost but freed, and he understood, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that this was what awaited everyone in 2030. Not physical death, but death to the illusion of separation, rebirth into the recognition of unity, transformation from fear-based consciousness to love-based consciousness. The veil was thinning, the signs were multiplying, the moment was approaching. As 2030 dawned, Thomas found himself in a state of heightened awareness that bordered on overwhelming. Every moment felt pregnant with significance. Every interaction seemed to carry layers of meaning. The boundary between dreaming and waking had become so permeable that sometimes he couldn't tell which state he was in. He wasn't alone in this. Reports flooded in from around the world, people experiencing spontaneous visions, telepathic connections, moments of unity consciousness where they felt their separation from others and from the universe dissolve completely. The beings were appearing more frequently, no longer hiding, but showing themselves openly to anyone with eyes to see. Governments tried to maintain control, to explain away what was happening as mass hysteria, or natural phenomena, or elaborate hoaxes. But their explanations grew more and more strained as the evidence mounted. The old paradigm was collapsing, its certainties crumbling, its authority evaporating. In July of 2030, something happened that made headlines across the world. A massive light appeared over Jerusalem, visible for hours, witnessed by millions. The same light appeared over Mecca, over the Vatican, over sacred sites in India, Japan, Peru, Egypt. Everywhere humans had ever reached for the divine seemed to be reaching back. The beings no longer needed to hide. They appeared on television broadcasts, interrupting regular programming to deliver a message that was simultaneously heard in every language, understood by every consciousness capable of receiving it. The time has come. The transformation begins now. You have been prepared. You have been loved. You have been guided every step of the way. What comes next is your choice to resist and suffer, or to surrender and be reborn. Choose love. Choose unity. Choose to remember who you truly are. This is not the end. This is the beginning. This is the moment your species has been building toward since your first ancestors looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone. You are not alone. You have never been alone. And now, finally, You are ready to join the greater community of conscious beings that spans this universe and beyond. Do not be afraid. Fear is the only enemy. Love is the only reality. In the days ahead, reality as you have known it will shift. Those who are ready will shift with it. Those who resist will have the opportunity to continue their lessons in other contexts. But know this, all souls eventually find their way home. All consciousness eventually awakens. The universe is patient. It will wait as long as necessary for every fragment of itself to remember its true nature. Thomas watched this broadcast from his truck, parked at a rest stop somewhere between Casper and Cheyenne, the same route he'd been driving for nearly 20 years. He felt the stone in his pocket, the one the woman in the diner had given him so long ago. He felt Mary's presence, Michael's presence, the presence of every soul he'd ever connected with, living or dead, and he felt the shift beginning. It started subtly, a tingling in his extremities, a sense of his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of his body. He could feel the truck around him, not as separate, but as part of him. The air, the earth, the sky, all of it connected, all of it one vast organism of which he was an inseparable part. The tingling intensified, becoming a vibration that seemed to resonate with a frequency just beyond normal perception. Thomas closed his eyes and saw light, not external light but internal, emanating from every cell, every atom, every quantum of his being. He was made of light. He had always been made of light. The density of matter had been an illusion, a temporary garment worn for the purpose of having experiences in this dimension, and now the garment was being shed. Thomas felt himself rising, though his body remained seated in the truck. His consciousness expanded, encompassing first the rest stop, then the highway, then Wyoming, then the continent, then the planet itself. He could feel billions of other consciousnesses going through the same process, some smoothly, some with resistance, all being held in a vast field of love that permeated everything. He saw Earth from space, surrounded by a web of light. Every awakened soul a node in that web, their combined consciousness creating a field of such intensity that it was pulling others into awareness, catalyzing transformation in those who were ready, offering invitation to those who weren't. And he saw the beings, not as separate from humanity, but as future versions of what humanity was becoming, guides who had walked this path before and were now midwifing humanity's graduation into galactic citizenship. The process lasted hours or seconds. Time had lost meaning. When Thomas finally opened his eyes, returned to his body, reintegrated with the physical dimension, he found that the world looked different. Colors were more vivid. Sounds carried meanings beyond their acoustic properties. The veil between dimensions had lifted, allowing him to perceive multiple realities simultaneously. He could see people's souls now, glowing inside their bodies like candles inside lanterns. Some burned bright, having made the shift into higher consciousness. Others flickered uncertainly, caught between paradigms, not quite ready to let go of the old, but unable to deny the new. And a few had gone dark, their fear so intense that they'd chosen to disconnect, to deny what was happening, to cling to the dissolving paradigm until it pulled them under. Thomas wept for the ones who couldn't make the shift, understanding now that they weren't being punished or abandoned, but were simply exercising their free will, choosing to continue learning through suffering because they weren't yet ready to learn through love. But the majority, the vast, beautiful majority, had made it through. Humanity had graduated. Not every soul, but enough. The critical mass had been reached. The transformation was irreversible. Thomas picked up his CB radio, not knowing what he would say, but trusting that the right words would come. This is Big Sky calling all trucks, all souls, all beings who can hear this. We made it. We're on the other side. The long night is over. The dawn has come. And it's more beautiful than any of us imagined. Responses flooded in, voices crying and laughing and praising and testifying, all sharing their experiences of the shift, all confirming what Thomas already knew. That reality had fundamentally changed, that humanity had been reborn, that the impossible had become possible. And somewhere, in a dimension that touched this one but extended far beyond it, Thomas felt Mary smiling, felt Michael celebrating, felt every being who had ever guided him sending waves of love and congratulation and welcome. Welcome home, came the familiar communication, the voice of the being from that November night 5 years ago. Welcome to the next chapter. Welcome to the beginning of your real work. Not preparing for transformation, but living it, embodying it, demonstrating to those who come after what's possible when fear is released and love is embraced. You did well, Thomas. You helped more souls than you know. Your presence, your authenticity, your willingness to be vulnerable and share your truth, it created ripples that touched thousands of lives. This is what we meant when we said your work mattered. This is what we meant when we said you were already doing it. The journey continues. Different challenges await. Learning to navigate this new reality, helping those who are struggling with the transition, building the structures and systems that will support this new level of consciousness. But you won't face these challenges alone. None of you will. The community of awakened souls spans this planet now and beyond it. You are part of a galactic family, Thomas. You always have been, but now you remember. Thomas sat in his truck, watching the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed to sing with meaning. He thought about all the miles he'd driven, all the loads he'd delivered, all the moments of loneliness and grief and doubt that had brought him to this point. And he understood that it had all been necessary, all been perfect, all been part of a pattern so vast and intricate that only now, from this elevated perspective, could he begin to see its beauty. The road stretched ahead, the same road he'd driven 1,000 times before, but everything had changed. He had changed, reality had changed. The kingdom that had always been at hand was now visible to anyone with eyes to see. Thomas put his truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, driving into a future that shimmered with infinite possibility, carrying within his heart the greatest truth he'd ever learned, that love is real, that consciousness is eternal, that separation is illusion, and that the universe has been conspiring since the beginning of time to bring all its fragments back into awareness of their unity. The stars appeared overhead, one by one, ancient light reaching Earth after journeys of thousands of years, and Thomas understood that he was seeing not distant suns, but family members, not lifeless matter but conscious beings, all part of the same cosmic dance, all singing the same song of transformation and return. He drove through the night, no longer alone, never alone again, carrying his grain toward destinations that mattered less than the journey itself, knowing that every mile was sacred, every moment was precious, every breath was a miracle. The old world had died, the new world had been born, and somewhere between them, in the eternal now that had always existed but could finally be perceived, Thomas Harker, trucker, widower, witness, guide, drove forward into mystery, into light, into the infinite adventure of awakening. Truth or fiction, perhaps even the storyteller doesn't know. Here stories exist to touch and make you reflect. The magical only reveals itself to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on seeking certainties.